I want to welcome you all back. What an extraordinary day of fascinating presentations and very exciting conversations. I hope you all have as good a time as I have today. We have a capstone on the day, a wonderful evening ahead of us. We started last night with the first keynote address, thinking about that mysterious thin blue line, that thin layer where the depth of reality is brought into consciousness, the infinity of all things. Tonight we're going to talk about what's happening in that thin blue line, or what has happened in the past, what's happening now, and what it may imply for what's happening elsewhere in the cosmos as well. Our speaker is Simon Conway Morris. He's a paleontologist, evolutionary biologist, and astrobiologist. He received his doctorate in geology from the University of Cambridge and is currently Emeritus Professor of Evolutionary Paleobiology in the Department of Earth Sciences at Cambridge. He's known especially for he's known earliest for his work on the Burgess Shale, which became the foundation information for a famous book by Stephen Jay Gould called Wonderful Life, which some of you may have read. I first got to know Simon quite a few years ago when I read his book, Life Solution. The subtitle is Inevitable Humans in a Lonely Universe. Pretty amazing title. I spent the last week reading and then rereading his more recent book, From Extraterrestrials to Animal Minds, 6 Myths of Evolution. It's quite a fascinating book. I very much enjoyed it. So I mentioned the Burgess Shale and Stephen Jay Gould. Well, Gould was, as you may know, a Harvard evolutionary biologist. He was one of the most influential public voices in biology in the 20th century. He referred to Simon Conway Morris as the most important paleobiologist of the 20th century. Unfortunately, or fortunately, they got into some disagreements as life went on. And as Simon looked more deeply at what he was seeing and thought about it, he started to change his views and come up with some fairly unorthodox and controversial views about biology. But I don't see them so much as controversial. I think they're kind of obviously true. But that's my prejudice too, I guess. But he started to think, he started to see direction and purpose in the evolutionary process, which is an extraordinarily brave thing to do in a field like his. And so we're invited to a real treat of a person who is at once brilliant and at the same time has the courage and willingness to confront current prevailing ideas, to challenge them and open the world to, I think, a more appreciative view of biology. And if you stop to think about it, quite a few of the problems we're having in our civilization today go right back to the root of wrong understanding of where we've come from and what forces have shaped us. So we're extraordinarily lucky to have Simon here tonight, and all the more because he's crossed so many time zones. You may have heard the story of the Oxford Don, who, when he was told that he had to teach a 9 o'clock class, said, "Why, nobody should stay up that late." So Simon is actually only giving this lecture at 1 a.m. And the only other thing I want to tell you is that he's wearing his chimpanzee necktie, all covered with images of chimpanzees. So please welcome Simon Conway Morris.
Good evening, and thank you very much for such a generous introduction. I want to say straight away that I'm extraordinarily grateful to Bill and to Margaret Cavendish for getting me here and facilitating things in all possible way, and also to Carter as well. In this particular case, I need to explain in parenthesis that he almost drowned in my gin and tonic last night. More or less, but he was quite understanding about it in any case, but fortunately it was an isotopically light ice, so nothing to worry about, no global warming there perhaps. Shush. Dear, oh dear, so nice to be back in America. Yes. Well, you kindly say that, but of course the first thing I've got to do, because this is America, is to engage with an advert. And in point of fact, this is just briefly to explain that this is our country cottage, and it's fully booked till Easter. But afterwards, if any of you are interested in actually securing a rental, access is a little tricky, but in any event, it's certainly there for your pleasure. Now, I have been kindly brought here from Cambridge to give a talk, but I'm fully aware that in this society in particular, choice is extraordinarily important. So I've taken the precaution of bringing a couple of alternative talks, just in case they're of greater interest. And the first one, and I'll just ask for a simple show of hands, if that's all right, thank you. Is indeed, yes, that's right. Precisely, yeah. There we are. Good man. There we are. And quite so. And you know that these people will tell you about the narrow gauge issue. That's absolutely correct. That's right. Brazilian steel and other questions, so forth. Yeah. So that's possibly a sort of boy's interest, if you like. To some extent, in any case. Another area which I think we have to reflect on extremely carefully, and this is something I want you to take with the utmost seriousness, of course, needless to say, especially as I'm English, is health and safety and the sheer importance of protecting students and other people from potential harm and things like that. And the next slide I'm going to show you may, for some of you, be quite disturbing. So if you don't want to look, just look away in the normal way. This is what do you call it? Trigger warning. There we go. Got it right at last. Yeah. There we are. Yes, exactly. Precisely. Exactly right. Yeah. I mean, look at it. Where's the safety harness? Where's the high visibility jacket? Where's the clipboard? Oh, God. Just ridiculous. So there we are. That's one which, at least in my country, we take with the utmost seriousness, of course, needless to say. And the third of my alternative talks is one which I think, if I may say so, may prove the most popular. And that, of course, is the deep question. Exactly. of Labrador metaphysics. And in due course, as we will discover, you may well inquire what is going on inside the head of that animal. And the answer, as I will explain in more detail in a few minutes, is absolutely nothing. Or indeed, here I am for the talk I'm meant to be giving. And this too, as you may have already gathered, is an attempt to unhinge you completely. So a little bit of background. As Bill mentioned, I'm a sort of evolutionary biologist, and in the best schemes of English teaching, I will, of course, be making a whole series of statements which I will brook no opposition. Or rather, in question time, I'll most happily return to them. So I'm going to make a whole series of, observations and so forth. But just by background, the first thing we might suggest with regard to life in the universe is it's going to be carbon-based, certainly. And I think also, almost certainly, it will have the same biochemistry as we do. And again, I'm very happy to defend these viewpoints. Not everybody agrees. So we'll have things like DNA and the replications, folding proteins and all that sort of good thing. Another thing, which in fact I will turn to in just a moment, is that it seems that on this planet, in a sense, the envelope of all possibilities has been effectively reached. And this is of some importance in astrobiology because, of course, the notion is that most planets will be possibly habitable, at least within the habitable zone, but will not be really pretty places to hang around. They'll be pretty grim, frankly, and therefore be mostly tenanted by so-called extremophiles. These are bacteria of one sort and the other. And again, I'm not going to unpack this in any detail, but in this particular case here, we have a bacterium which happily lives above the temperature of boiling water. And correspondingly, if we look at salinity or water activity and those sorts of areas, in point of fact, in every case, we have bacteria, which we can argue have gone as far as you possibly can. And by that way, we can actually determine, I think, potentially that the oceans in Europa, the Jovian moon, which are saline, are actually too saline to allow life to exist there, at least if life on this planet is anything to go by. So that's the sort of background. So in some ways, we should be quite confident about what we see in this planet. We've done pretty well. And indeed, bacteria do most of the heavy lifting in any case, and they've explored really all possibilities. Now, linked to that is that within evolutionary biology, the received tenets remain, I think it's true to say, that it's effectively an open-ended process, that you can throw the dice as many times as you like, and you'll end up with as many different solutions at the end of the day. I won't talk about it here, I'm afraid, though it's something which interests me very much. But the ideas of randomness in evolution with things like, for instance, excuse me, I'll just get my gin. It always comes in a Harrods spring water, don't believe a word of it. 47.3 Tanqueray, delicious. Is that in terms of the dice, people typically think of things like mutations and so forth. And another one which is generally regarded as radically redirecting evolution, but alas, I can't unpack it in any detail, are mass extinctions. But in point of fact, mass extinctions paradoxically are creative. You can't do without them. All they do is they give you time for nothing. They accelerate a process of evolution, which is going to happen sooner or later. So roll on the mass extinctions. Not too often, every 50 million years, thank you, that'll do. Within this context of the randomness of evolution, as Bill mentioned in passing, and Stephen Jay Gould's observation, indeed based on the Burgess Shale, that, and I don't need to read the whole thing out, you can capably read yourself unless you want. I have got the opera glasses under your chairs right at the back, so if you need those, they're just on a little package, you can keep the package as well. That were you to rerun the tape of life, as with the Burgess Shale, then the likelihood of anything like a human intelligence is vanishingly small. Well, as I'll try and explain very briefly, this seems to me the exact reverse of what is going to be the case. Something like a human, I have suggested, is very much on the cards. But these ideas of counterfactuals, I think, are intellectually very interesting indeed. And many of you will be familiar with the books which explore the alternative versions of history. In this country, Gettysburg might have gone to the Confederates and things like that, or this rather depressing illustration here. And indeed, I think if Halifax had become the premier rather than Churchill, and Churchill will appear later as well, I'm very pleased to say, then it's more than likely that we would have made an accommodation with the Nazis, and that, of course, would have eventually led almost certainly to the overrunning of our country. Now, in these two books, What If and More What If, edited by Robert Cowley, one of the chapters, by a chap called Oscar Eyre, if I remember correctly, says, well, what would have happened, I think it's on the 3rd of April, 33 AD, and fortunately I'm with an audience where I don't have to explain who these people are, which makes a nice change, doesn't it? If the procurator Pontius Pilate had indeed released Jesus, and there are a number of reasons to think, from what we know about him, what we know about Sejanus, what we know about the emperor and so forth, this is pretty unlikely. But in the essay, actually, it's explored extremely cleverly as to indeed, had Jesus been released, improbable as it may sound, then, of course, we wouldn't have a Christian religion, would we? But read the essay, and you'll find something quite entertaining at the end of that. So, with respect to counterfactuals in human history, indeed, you might actually think that there are deeper patterns in history as well, which lead perhaps to certain outcomes. It's a controversial area for obvious reasons. In biology, again, as Bill mentioned very briefly, the idea is that with regards to the likelihood of repeated solutions evolving via convergent evolution, then the take-home example is to do with the camera eyes of the octopus and the cuttlefish and things like that, and the human. And we know that the cuttlefish is actually rather closely related to an earthworm, and I don't want to worry about this, but you're quite closely related to a starfish. There we go, that's the way it goes, I suppose. But in any event, the construction of these two camera eyes is strikingly similar to each other. Again, we could unpack this, but the differences actually, ironically, turn out to be similarities at a deeper level, which turns out to be quite interesting. But the common ancestors clearly possess nothing more sophisticated than a small pinpoint-like eye, a very simple eye. So this is a very striking example of convergence. I mentioned a moment again the pleasures of drinking gin, and here's an even more striking example of convergent evolution, which I think you might be interested in. I can only display on this one here, but with regard to the similarity between the intoxication of humans and fruit flies, they are indeed strikingly similar. And let me explain. So here we've got a very complicated piece of apparatus called the inebriometer. And this is constructed with huge government grants. And what it actually consists of is about 500 individual cells, which contain each one an individual fruit fly. And the fruit flies are wandering up and down. And then you suffuse the whole of the inebriometer with alcohol fumes, bliss, pure bliss. And what we see is that, in fact, the flies then start to, this is when the alcohol is introduced as a vapor, they start racing around all over the place. And you must remember, of course, as we hope we will see in probably just over an hour, the same thing's going to happen here. that everybody's roaring away, rushing around. And then it turns out, at least so far as the fruit fly is concerned, actually very quickly, after a few minutes, they start to move much more slowly. And this is where people in our situation can't get through the crowd or can't find a corkscrew, these sort of things like that. And then the fruit flies then start to accelerate again. They reach a plateau at around about 12 minutes here, and then after that they move more and more slowly until about 20 minutes they die. But overall, this convergence, and I hasten to say, like nearly everything I'm going to tell you is not my work, and therefore is reliable. The point here is, in fact, these are similarities between our intoxication and that of the fruit fly, for very good reasons, are actually strikingly similar. So that's fine and all well and good. But if going against Gould's supposition that human-like intelligence is vanishingly unlikely, we now know that there is the most enormous number of extrasolar planets. They run into the hundreds of millions. And there's also good reason to think that the majority will actually be of Earth-like size. And of course, many of them will not be in their habitable zones. But on the other hand, the numbers are so large that one might suppose that the likelihood of other planets eventually giving rise to intelligence across the galaxy are actually rather high. Now, they're not all going to be the same, of course. And we can have lots of fun and games working out, let us say in this particular example, this is a low-gravity moon. You can see the gas giant behind, just the rings are just visible as well. And at first sight, this artist has done their level best to depict this thing in a truly alien fashion. But any biologist will draw attention immediately to the fundamental similarities of the way that limbs must work, the way nervous systems must work, even the respiratory pigments, hemerythrin or hemoglobin, things like that. All of these are things which have evolved multiple times on this planet, and we have reasonable confidence will be employed anywhere else, simply because they are pretty well the best solution. And that's all fine and large, and therefore, if you're in charge of SETI Institute or NASA or the European Space Agency, one is full of confidence that very shortly we will hear from what's going on out there. But, unfortunately, unless there's been some news since 6 o'clock, by the way, if you do, don't tell me because it will ruin my talk, but the so-called, what David Brin referred to as the great silence, in other words, to date, there's absolutely no trace at all of anything which might be indicative of contact of any sort of civilization at all. And this was articulated many years ago by the remarkable man Enrico Fermi, an Italian who left Mussolini's Italy. His wife was Jewish, and a very good idea to get out of that country at that time. And he, of course, had a fundamental role in the Manhattan Project in this country, as well as a bit just down the road, actually, the first operational nuclear pile in Chicago. And Fermi famously, with this conversation he was having some people in a restaurant in Los Alamos about 1950, said, "Where are they?" And we could actually suspect he was talking more about the probabilities of interstellar travel rather than specifically the absence of aliens. But either way, this is now known as the Fermi paradox. And the problem with the Fermi paradox, excuse me, because this gin is good, do you mind? Terrific. Never had tonic, by the way. The problem with the Fermi paradox is that it's now apparent that there are many extrasolar systems which significantly predate ours. We're about 4.6 billion years old, and the evidence for that in terms of meteorites is just perfect. But other ones predate us by some billions of years. Now, if indeed they too have developed sentient forms which eventually are going to go walkabout, some galactic diaspora and so forth, then they're going to arrive on this planet around about the time of the Burgess Shale. And there in the shallow lagoons of a Burgess Shale sea, there are little things which look slightly like an eel. And these people are not only galactic travelers, they're also gourmets. And they say, let's see what these taste like. Up. They scoop them, put them in a line on toast, get a bottle of Chablis out, and all the rest of the thing. There's only one problem with this. They've just eaten our ancestors. In other words, we shouldn't be here. And therefore, there have been many, many attempts to try and explain the Fermi paradox. Now, Stephen Webb has a very fine book with this, some 72 of them. And I'm just going to whistle through a few possible examples, any one of which, and this is a glorious thing about science, is maybe right. You know, tomorrow we may, in one sense or another, know. The first one, which seems slightly improbable, perhaps, is actually you don't exist at all. And again, this comes as a bit of a blow, but heck, you know. We live in a virtual universe. And this is not quite as bonkers as, sorry, I use an English technical term there. This is not, no, this is not quite as daft. That's a Saxon term, never mind. It's not quite as crazy as it's unlikely, and in fact there are ways you can test it, but it is conceivably correct. I don't think it is. Another explanation for the Fermi paradox, which is much more reasonable, is of course we've only looked in a tiny cross-section of what might be eventually examined. So we just have to spend more time looking harder, and that may well be the case. I mean, nobody can doubt that at all. Or, and again, this may be one with real force, is actually the origin of life is not difficult, but almost impossible. And again, that doesn't go too well with the general received orthodoxies about the way in which the basic building blocks of life are made with great facility in carbonaceous meteorites and so forth. But their assembly into a functioning cell still remains deeply mysterious, and it is conceivable that actually the origin of life on this planet, or maybe Mars, it doesn't matter terribly, was actually very, very unlikely. Well, a few more ways in which we can put nascent civilizations out of action is if you have the misfortune to live in a galaxy which has a major gamma ray burst, and you don't want to be around then. The amount of energy released from these things is absolutely staggering. And that's absolutely fine if you remain in the oceans, because the radiation doesn't go very far into the water. But if you're on land, you're basically fried. But the problem here is that as I understand it, gamma ray bursts, these intense things, may possibly be the collisions of neutron stars or a supernova, in any respect, are not so characteristic of the sort of galaxy which we live in. So we are relatively safe. Or we may just blow ourselves up. And I know, of course, Mr. Putin keeps on talking about these things, doesn't he? He's only going to use small ones, he tells us, and I suppose it's a bit of a relief, but well, not if anything goes to plan at the moment. But it is conceivable that civilizations themselves are metastable and don't have long-term survival prospects. And all of us know, obviously, with current cultural pessimisms, with so-called global warming and various things like that, you could imagine that, in fact, all of us sign our own death warrants as soon as we walk out of the caves. I don't think this is the case, but even so, it's a possibility. One popular amongst biologists, and again would appear at first sight to have considerable force, is the notion of so-called bottlenecks. And of course, the classic example, again, I can only point at this central side here, is, for instance, the origin and early evolution of the eukaryotic cell. That's what you're made of, and effectively that is a necessary precondition for such matters as multicellularity. So plants and fungi and ourselves are all eukaryotes. And the idea here is that you have to have a very, very unusual concatenation of circumstances which together, by chance, effectively allow the assembly of this much more complex form from pre-existing, principally archaeal bacteria. The snag with this, in my view, is in point of fact, and this is something which I think is slightly underappreciated in evolution, is that, to use the cliche, a great deal of the heavy lifting you need to make complex forms, including brains as it so happens as well, are actually done in much more simple organisms. So the groundwork for a nervous system is being laid down in single-celled organisms. In the prokaryotes, a significant part of the cytoskeleton, which is used for other functions, but then is co-opted by the subsequent eukaryotes. So with so much of the stuff on the factory floor ready to be recruited and assembled in this way, it seems to me that the bottlenecks is less of a problem than is sometimes being suggested. For some years, rare earth has had an influence and may still be correct. There are lots and lots of extrasolar planets, billions of them. But on the other hand, there may be unusual set of circumstances with regard to the Earth, including the possession of a rather large moon and things like that, and plate tectonics and such matters, which collectively lead to an unusually stable and propitious environment, which allows life to flourish in a way which otherwise would more or less keep it at a microbial level, a pond scum, as Peter Ward described it. And this, again, is a possibility. But there are, again, really going back to Enrico Fermi, a few sort of warning signals to suggest that we're going to have to be pretty optimistic pretty quickly before we give up completely. And this is why. If, and this of course is an assumption, technologies evolve such that they need increasing amounts of energy, so they harvest not the sun in the way that we do with a field full of wheat, but actually enclose part of the adjacent solar system to trap this energy in a system of collectors, which then feed the planet, or planetismals, or whatever. The net result is that re-radiated energy comes out as an infrared, which is very readily, as you know from the James Webb Telescope, is very, as we heard yesterday, is very readily detectable. And a number of searches have already been done for these so-called Dyson spheres, after the famous Dyson, a most remarkable scientist, originally English, but of course in Princeton for much of his life, with no success whatsoever. But it's still early days perhaps. But again, you might wonder, as has been suggested, whether rather than harvesting the energy of a star or star sister, star cluster, they might begin to harvest the energy of an entire galaxy. And this again is at the edges of science possibility rather than science fiction, but it's not inconceivable, perhaps 100 million years down the line. And the advantage of this is that, of course, there are huge numbers of galaxies, and in surveys of galaxies which are anomalous in terms of infrared radiation, something in the order of 500,000 galaxies have been searched with the possibility of identifying a so-called Kardashev Type 3 civilization. And although there are a few anomalies which are, in terms of infrared, peculiar, all of them seem to have a natural explanation. And this gives me pause for thought. So here we have galaxies which predate our own galaxy and solar systems even more so. But we'll keep on looking, and this is an idea, and please, if anybody here is a physicist, do not ask if we have time for questions for me to explain it. I will flounder desperately. Doomed to a third, as we say in Cambridge. But the notion here would be that if one is in a spacecraft which is moving at close to the speed of light, and therefore is a relativistic object, on the lower panels you've got what the person traveling close to the speed of light would see in terms of the constellations versus the familiar constellation of Orion on the far side there. But as I understand it, the interference of this relativistic object in terms of the background of the cosmic, the background microwave radiation would actually be detectable. So if there are people zooming around the galaxy or even in between galaxies with some sort of almost unbelievable craft like that, we might actually be able to recognize them. So, one can do clever things. But to date, as mentioned, things are rather quiet out there. Now, there is a very strong argument, in point of fact, that if we did get a signal, you would put down the telephone immediately. Just say, if it happens in your office, who knows? It could be. Just say we're busy or, whatever, or, or in my country, they're on strike, or festooning the M25, for instance. Yeah. Well, actually, that one would probably persuade them not to come here, but that's another story. But even if we get signals and messages rather than actual physical contact, which perhaps is more likely, the first thing we want to ask ourselves is, would we have any idea what they were saying? And a number of people here actually, not here, but I mean, investigating the possibility of various sort of xeno-languages. And here I just mentioned a couple of examples which give me, again, slight pause for thought. The other one, many of you will have heard of. This is a famous Voynich manuscript, most extraordinary thing. There was an article in TLS a couple of years ago suggesting it might be Kabbalistic, but it seems, I think, to defy interpretation. And below, this is a wooden tablet from Easter Island with a script which I believe is referred to as Rongo Rongo. Now, that's really all I know about it, but this too, I'm told, has defied interpretation. I mean, one can be pretty sure that, at least in my country, it would say 2 pints, please, and could you put the cat out, or something like that, you know. And almost certainly the extraterrestrial civilization messages will be much the same. But here things turn even more interestingly, perhaps, because it may turn out, in fact, that yes, indeed, there are innumerable planets well populated with animals, like ourselves, and they are indeed grunting, squawking, squealing, purring, and doing all the sorts of things which animals do. And we should have some confidence in this because, of course, we know that sooner or later one or two of the groups will develop some degree of intelligence, and so far as our immediate ancestors are concerned, that's about 6 million years ago. So we should have some reassurance that, you know, the increased intelligence, encephalization, all those good things will lead indeed to something like ourselves. Except that here too, and this is really what I've want to spend about 10 minutes talking about, is that it may not be as simple as that. Now, I don't know how many of you have heard of the Australian philosopher David Stope. I never met him, unfortunately. It sounded like great company. He smoked too much, he drank, it was great fun. But in this book here, which you would not normally show to a group of consenting biologists, you can read here Darwinian fairy tales. And what Stowe is saying, as a philosopher, is if you're going to try and persuade me that what goes on in terms of the cognitive abilities of this child here, reading note, versus his chums in the case behind him, you must be joking. And he gives a whole set of examples, including such matters as the origin of morality and ethics and so forth. And as a philosopher, is totally unpersuaded by the fact that although indubitably there is evolutionary continuity, in terms of cognitive continuity, we might have to do some rethinking. And I like to capture it in this particular way with this slide here, because the caption which goes with it is, what other species would think this is a sensible thing to do? You know, the trouble with us is we do not realize how utterly peculiar we are. We're the worst people to study ourselves. But I've been reading fairly extensively into animal behavior, and I have to report that things aren't looking too good. Now, any of you here work on animal behavior will realize I'm going to go quite fast and loose. But there is a recurrent, and I think, again, this was referred to, in fact, I think by Alistair McIntyre's talk this afternoon, of anthropomorphism. It is practically impossible to get yourself out of the human frame. The people who do this work have all sorts of protocols to try and avoid this. But we are always reading things into how animals behave from a human perspective. And from one point of view, that is perfectly reasonable. And then we have this whole set of experiments and observations. And again, I'm not going to unpack these in any detail, but the whole set of experiments, and these involved especially the dogs Rico and Chaser, heroes of the dog world, which could recognize the names of their toys. So off they go, and a great pile of toys, and you say, get Rhino, and off he goes. You know what dogs are like going like this, you know, because all they want is a treat when they come back. Another story. And it seemed at first sight they really did understand what the name of the animal was, but the toy, that is. But then when you investigate this a bit more closely, this is not the case at all. They don't actually understand what the name is. And in a way, what I'm going to try and do in a few minutes is just get nail after nail into this argument and bang them in as hard as possible, which collectively suggests that there is a fundamental gap between what we enjoy in terms of our cognitive understanding and the animals. And don't misunderstand me, I'm not talking the animals down at all. What they do brilliantly. What they need, they use. That's absolutely fine. So to give one such example, Aesop's fable, the idea here of the crow which is thirsty, dropping the stones into the pitcher, the level of the stone rises, and the thirsty crow assuages his thirst. And correspondingly, we can do experiments here whereby you have, I must say, the water there looks absolutely filthy. I hope they change it at some point. Whereby you train, that's important, the crow to drop objects into the tube and the water raises. So the argument goes within the brain of this thing is a proto-Archimedes. But what you then do is make things slightly more complicated, and rather wickedly, you have a set of tubes, some of which are connected beneath the platform on which the crow is standing, and some of them are connected and some of them aren't. And it becomes very quickly clear that the crow has no causal understanding at all. It cannot join the dots. It will eventually work out what to do by trial and error, and that's perfectly reasonable. We even do that ourselves. But there is no rationality there at all. Another unremarked comment about animals is the amount of training you need to do. Now, dogs, as we have a dog at home, so I think I know what I'm talking about, perhaps, who knows. Dogs are actually the worst possible example. They're semi-symbiotic with us. They are very much our companions. But in terms of general training, I'll just give you one example. In almost all cases, the amount of training these animals require is absolutely staggering. So there's one example where they decided with some rhesus monkeys, 2 of them, whether in fact they were able to engage in entrainment. I'll come back to that in a second. So they got a metronome and changed the pitch and all this sort of thing. And they spent an entire year seeing whether the rhesus monkey could entrain. Net result, failure all round. And this is a magnificent and important result because it tells us something fantastically important. It doesn't tell us anything about rhesus monkeys at all. It tells us a great deal about us. What other species would spend a year trying to train a rhesus monkey? You know, just hats off to us. Here's another one which is regularly rolled out, and again, perfectly reasonable. Animals use tools. Indeed, they do. But effectively, first of all, there's no simple correlation between animal intelligence and tool use, but much more importantly, no animal ever uses one tool to make another tool. And if they can't do that, then they will never have a cumulative technology. So corresponding, some of you will be familiar with this astonishing astronomical calculator from the Aegean, the Antikythera mechanism, which is probably around about 100 AD, which is actually based on Ptolemaic system. You know, he got it right, old boy. But the thing here is that, again, the tool use here is something which is a local ecology. And indeed, people have also pointed out that some of the chimpanzees use sticks in one way, others use them another way, some go for one's ants on the forest floor, and they've described these as cultures, and that's perfectly fair, except, as has also been pointed out, these chimpanzees may indeed have cultures, but they do not know that they have cultures. As already mentioned with regard to the rhesus monkeys, we have this extraordinary ability in sinister ways and in beautiful ways to entrain and dance and things like that. Animals effectively don't. And then we come on to even more important areas. One is that animals do not teach, ever. Well, there's one exception, it's ants. And the point here is that animals learn, but they're incapable of conveying information to a pupil. And this too tells us something rather important about their ability to understand what's going on inside the mind of the infant beside it. So in the case of a chimpanzee, learning how to crack open nuts with a stone, and it's mostly a female activity amongst the chimpanzees, it takes several years, and never does the mother chimpanzee say, "No, don't do that, you idiot, I'll stop fooling around, bring the rock over here, come on, you clown, stop wasting my time," etc., etc. And the reason, as I say, is because they cannot enter into the mind of their pupil. Mirror self-recognition, indeed so. Some species can, apparently, if you put an invisible mark by lightly anesthetizing themselves and then allowing them to wake up, they go up to the mirror, as I sometimes do in the morning, and say, "You had too much to drink last night, Simon, you're very, very stupid." But it turns out, first of all, that the number of species which can engage in so-called mirror self-recognition is rather limited. But much more importantly, is for all intents and purposes, be it magpies or some of the primates, or elephants even, these are all enculturated. They are ones which have been brought up in association with humans. And enculturated animals are significantly smarter than those which live in the wild. So never in the jungle are you going to see a chimpanzee looking in a jungle pool saying, "Oh, I'm still rather splendid today. What do you think? Haircut? I don't know, And here's something I came across very recently, and please don't misunderstand, I'm not trying to be negative about this. It's just suggesting what capacities they have, which are in such striking contrast to us. And this is a paper I came across only a month or so ago. Animals, including chimpanzees and gorillas, never say goodbye. They never say farewell. They'll greet each other after sometimes weeks or even months of separation with effusion, kissing, and hugging. But then when they wander off into the jungle, they never say goodbye, take care of yourself, see you soon, and things like that. And this tells me that, in a sense, for them, the future does not exist. And this is all part, of course, of the question about how they understand time, which we can look at in other ways. And then we sort of stem back even from that with regards to what it is which makes us human in so many ways. And clearly there are aspects which Bill is very interested in and others of ethics and so forth. But being something of a scientist, and what most fascinates me, and this applies far, far beyond just the sciences themselves, is our capacity for analogical thinking, our capacity to form categories, and our capacity to engage in abstract reasoning, not least in mathematics. And I'm sure many of you will be familiar with this quote from Jean Vigner in his wonderful 1960 essay, The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics. And I'm not a mathematician at all, but I know enough to understand that, conjuring something like a complex number out of thin air and then suddenly finding it has traction should leave you, as indeed Vigner says, amazed. And so correspondingly, we have a whole series of insights which will be perpetually invisible to animals, which hardly have the capacity for ordinality and for all intents and purposes have no capacity for cardinality either. Now the next two slides, because I'm aware of time, I'm just going to skip through, but to say briefly that this also applies to animal music, as I once thought there was a greater similarity between that, animal music and human music, and move on to the last part of what I want to say, which of course is crucial, I think, in really all respects, and that is to do with language. And this has been widely agreed to be. Even those people who are unashamed about utter cognitive continuity between animals and ourselves will agree that animals per se do not have language. The star example of what might be a stepping stone are the vervet monkeys, with these alarm calls which refer, in this particular case, they didn't get it right, to the eagle, but otherwise to the snake or to the leopard. But for a whole set of reasons, one can show beyond reasonable doubt that to refer to these alarm calls in any sense as being proto-words is utterly misleading. They do not convey meaning in the sense which our language constructs, as again I think Alistair mentioned, with regard to recursion and matters like that. So where does our language come from? Well, here I go somewhat off-piste because I'm enormously influenced by the work of Owen Barfield, who has been mentioned several times at talks I've been at in the last couple of days. Barfield, as I'm sure practically everybody here knows, was one of the Inklings, and Lewis himself said he was by far the cleverest of the Inklings. And if that's not terrifying you, I really don't know what does. And it would be very, very difficult to summarize what Barfield writes in Poetic Diction and a number of his other works. And my intention here is not that you should be able to read this, but it's really an aide-memoire to the effect that Barfield is arguing several things, but in essence they're twofold, I think. And the first is that our consciousness itself has evolved and changed and may well be leading to possibly more optimistic endpoints. He's quite actually positive in that respect. But correspondingly, the way in which words are invented or come out of thin air and change, but also that earlier on, to the very first approximation, I apologize for those who know Barfield much better than I do, are effectively mythopoeic. That here one has something which is going into a set of foundational understandings about the way the world is. And everybody likes to use the example, the Greek word pneuma for breath or soul and spirit and all the rest of it. And Barfield himself had enormous influence on J.R.R. Tolkien. And Tolkien himself said that effectively the languages came first and then Middle-earth followed. And this, again, echoes, I think, what Barfield is telling us. And as most of you will realize, is so utterly orthogonal to the standard received wisdom of either transformation of animal vocalizations or Chomsky's ideas and all the rest of it, as to suggest that one is looking at a radically different solution to what language is. And this actually has some bearing on where we might be today. Now, one of the advantages of living in Cambridge is that we have a lot of, well, some second-hand bookstores on the market. And this is a book I picked up several years ago, which some of you may know, by Paul Oppenheimer, called Evil and the Demonic. And it's mostly about films and a depiction of evil. And I'm not a great film goer, but I've still enjoyed reading it very much indeed. And I have to say the next few things I have to say are almost completely derived from what Paul Oppenheimer writes. Because he, in the central part of his book, explores what the nature of the Tower of Babel is. And again, I have to go quickly here. But the sort of general idea is it was a building project which sort of really ran out of money and out of control. And it ended up with people wandering in all sorts of directions and speaking different languages, having previously combined to build the tower using the same language. And that's more or less what the Old Testament Genesis account says. But in point of fact, it's much more complicated and much more interesting than that, because the early commentaries on the Tower of Babel, especially in the Jewish sources, unsurprisingly, and then adopted by other people, was that this was effectively an assault on heaven. This was an attempt to storm heaven itself. And there are various legendary accounts of archers at the top of the Tower of Babel firing arrows up into the sky, and the arrows falling back covered with blood, on the assumption that they'd either shot angels or possibly even God himself. And why this matters is because, as Oppenheimer is describing in his book, the Tower of Babel is something which is underlying the rise of chaos and destruction and the end of language. It's something which is indescribably evil and horrible. It's not just a building project. And so far as the legends go, although this is not on biblical authority, Dante puts Nimrod, who has an appearance very close to those passages to deal with the Tower of Babel, as actually being the builder of this, and as a penalty for attempting to storm the ramparts of heaven, Nimrod is chained adjacent to Satan himself. And here you can see Virgil and Dante themselves looking at him and these other pagan giants, locked forever, almost overlooking where the central pit housing Satan himself is. So this again is some indication. Now there are two things which follow from this. One is of local interest, and Carter and I were just talking about this very briefly, is that everybody here, and especially in Cambridge, are fully aware of the onslaughts with regard to our language being taken out of our control and whole sets of words being either changed in meaning, not in a Barfieldian way, or censored or dismissed or cancelled. And I mentioned Churchill earlier because he's not somebody you normally associate with free speech, but in point of fact, I was reading a wonderful book by a Washington-based journalist, whose name's escaped me, dealing with Orwell, of course, who generally has the major thing to say with regard to this, and Churchill himself. And you can probably imagine which side of this debate I stand on, and it is that if we start to be crushed by this sort of thing, we are in very serious danger indeed. And one person, in fact, who's actually made some contributions to this is John Cleese. And he himself has been amongst various people who are actually being adamant that we cannot allow our language to be crushed and distorted in this sort of way. But unfortunately, it gets a bit worse than that. It's really to go almost full circle to what Paul Oppenheimer himself was talking about, because this is the quote from Ephesians and so forth. And I don't want to be over melodramatic about this, as to argue that necessarily the things which are evil have a separate entity and power. My own sense is they probably do, but one doesn't have to subscribe to that idea. But what fascinates me about this particular assault on our language and the long shadow of the Tower of Babel is, in point of fact, it's something which is being explored by various people in various ways. And Oppenheimer in his book draws attention to Lear. And in the case of Lear, of course, the general idea is that the three daughters and the rest of it is something whereby you cannot use love as a commodity. And indeed, that is part of right at the beginning of the play. And I should say here, again, I'm not an expert of Shakespeare of any description at all. And the whole tenor of Lear is nothing but betrayal and distrust and murder and dishonesty. It's a society which has collapsed completely for the not entirely clear reasons of why Lear goes mad to begin with. But behind that, there is again this collapse of language. And these two quotes, one from the Duke of Albany and the other one from Lear's Fool here, again, I don't have to read these things out here, is trying to convey to you what happens when we actually lose language. We do not become animals again in that sort of way, but we actually lose our full humanness. And that is why language is so essential. And returning briefly to the Tower of Babel, there was another book which, of course, has been very influential, the sort of things I've read, and that, of course, is that book by C.S. Lewis, That Hideous Strength. And that hideous strength is taken as a quotation from a 16th century poet, which, of course, Lewis knew a great deal about. And those of you who know this book, which is a third of the trilogy, of the so-called Space Trilogy, will remember the banquet at Belbury, where Merlin effectively allows chaos, the Tower of Babel's shadow 6 miles longer to fall on the company here. And the thing is a bit like that thing in Ovid, is a time of complete and utter carnage. So Babel is something which is not just babbling. Babel is where our ability to be human is destroyed. And of course, if you have societies or groups who decide that they have control on language, then you are in really serious problems. But we needn't give up. Oh no, not at all. Because the last couple of things, perhaps worth saying, is that irrespective of where our language comes from, and indeed our minds, and my own view is that notwithstanding the size of the brain, our brains are much more like antennae. The mind is effectively external to ourselves in some sense. But there are many, many things we know about our minds which suggest that, in fact, as I hint in my title of my talk, that there are genuine and unending possibilities for transcendence. And once again, it's effectively deciding what sort of culture you wish to encourage. If you destroy language, then transcendence will be permanently abandoned. If, however, you are literally willing to keep your mind open, as I hope I am, and I hope you are too, then I know even from my own limited personal experience, there are all sorts of extraordinary ways in which we can transcend time and space. I know I'm going to die, and sooner rather than later, given my age, but even so, we have optimism about our futures. That would be a Christian promise, of course, but so too the sense that the orthogonal realities which are reflected in mathematics and poetry and the like are absolutely real, and they are something which is worth exploring. And I don't know whether some of you know Jeff Creeple in Rice University, and he's written a great deal, but the little panel on the side is Charles Fort, which generally leads to Fortean times and Sniggers and things like that. Well, Jeff's got a great deal more time for than Charles Fort than perhaps some people do. But in this book here, in particular, he's exploring both the work of Fort and also Vallée and people like that. And he's somebody who's completely open to the paranormal being part and parcel of what actually is part of our world. And David Griffin, another chap who's written about this quite extensively with regard to Whitehead, again, is very open to these possibilities. And if you are, then you may find your whole perspective ultimately changes. Let me just finish with 2 examples. This is something which we know is impossible. It cannot possibly happen. This is St. Joseph of Cupertino. But the reports by people we would otherwise trust that this chap, who by all accounts was of relatively limited intelligence, did actually fly. I know this is, and again, as a 20th century scientist, normally the men in the white coats come and say, "Come on, Dr. Conway, you kept these people long enough," and so forth. But the eyewitness accounts have no reason to think that they're lying. And one can think of other examples, Padre Pio in a rather different way, and the rest of it. And let me just finish with one other story, which I know some of you may have heard before, but I'm fond of it for various reasons, because it involves Father, or Monsignor actually, John O'Connor, who was, if you like, the prototype and also the great friend of G.K. Chesterton, and thereby Father Brown and the famous detective stories. And John O'Connor was a priest in northern England, not so far from Liverpool. And this is in the 30s. And one time on a Sunday morning, he's asked to go out to the local lunatic asylum. And they say, "We'd like to show you this, Father." And they take him literally to the padded cell. It's not this particular padded cell. And the warders explained that they'd allowed a lunatic in, being admitted the day beforehand, totally and utterly insane. They put him in there, and with his pigskin here, it minimizes their damage. In a time, you must remember, where there are effectively no treatments of drugs and things like that. They go back the following morning, and high up in the wall, there is a window, broken, and no sign of the prisoner. He's vanished completely. And if you read John O'Connor's book, the real Father Brown, some of you probably have, he gives this account here, and he just says, well, in a sense, I don't care whether you believe this or not. It happened. But I have to say then, when you look at the face of John O'Connor, doesn't he look a shifty liar? He really doesn't. Really the sort of chap you wouldn't really trust. So I will finish on that optimistic mode, if you like, with these fabulous paintings of the German artist, Caspar Friedrich. Sorry, I got it back to Friedrich Caspar. And this transcendental view, which poetry does for many people, less for me, painting for me most definitely, music undoubtedly so. and have some sense of optimism that at least we know who the enemy is, and even though we ourselves freely acknowledge our endless failings, God knows every possible way imaginable, even so, I think we have some reason for optimism. And I'll finish with my final slide, which is my favourite aircraft, the Spitfire. So thank you very much indeed. Thanks a lot.
Some questions?
No, of course, yes, it's okay, no, sure.
Okay, why don't you step over here? So we have a few minutes for questions. Who wants to go first?
Hello, my name is Bryce Mitchell. I'm from UW-Madison. So you mentioned when language is destroyed, hopes for transcendence will be abandoned. And my question is, my interpretation of the Tower of Babel has always been that it was a faulty attempt at transcendence, like transcendence without God. And especially like in that hideous strength, I've always seen that as sort of like a transhumanism prediction of the future where we attempt like transcendence.
Sure.
But in like a godless fashion. So I was wondering if you could just speak to that a little.
Thank you. I should say, this unfortunately was real water, but I did take the precaution and ask you for a glass of wine. So, no, I think what you're saying is absolutely fair. And I think that although it's the least popular of the three books of Lewis' thing, I think actually that hideous strength is the most germane to our present predicament. And it's certainly in terms of the so-called transhumanism and the like. But I think it's no accident that he used that quote from the name will come in a moment, Anderson, I think, of the original poem there. And there's anything not anything in the Bible, but with regard to any biblical passage, it's going to be open to a whole level of interpretations. And it seemed to me that actually it was Josephus' interpretation and his adoption by Dante and also by Milton and subsequently Kafka. And each one of these is indicating that although it might be, if you like, an attempt to sort of go to God or whatever, it's much more sinister than that. And as I reflect on the way at the moment, as Orwell explains so clearly with his Newspeak, that if you erode your language in this sort of way, then you won't be able to think about something. And that's why your possibilities of transcendence will not be available to you. But I take your point, absolutely. Yes, I have no dispute with what you say at all. No, but if that's a fair answer.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yes, hi, I'm Liam Waldron from Benedictine College. My question was on the monkeys and the ants and about how you said there are some examples of in the wild, like how monkeys can have limited form of language and communication to alert one another, and you said ants are the only species that you mentioned that can perform entrainment of any sort. Do you find these as anomalies or like potential progress towards like further evolution?
Well, no, thank you. The example with the ants is to do with teaching, and this is a thing of sort of so-called tandem running. And basically what they do is that one ant has to take another ant to where they want to go. So they get a short stick, and the leader controls the one behind. So in that sense, they're conveying instructions to them. With respect to any chimpanzee or indeed orangutan or whatever, I'm not for a moment disputing that they communicate. I mean, ironically, the vocalizations of chimpanzees and so forth are rather restricted, and they seem, so far as we can tell, to have more in the way of gestures and all the rest of it. But I would be no more persuaded that those vocalizations, or the much more vocal monkeys, have got anything to do with our language other than the production through a voice box or a syrinx in a bird. And actually, if you're looking for convergences between language and animal noises, the bird song is actually a much better example. But effectively what you see there are two things. First of all, although they can rearrange things, so some people will be willing to call that a syntax, it doesn't have any depth to it. It has no recursion to it. And even more importantly, and this is the case with all of these vocalizations, they're not exported for some other function. I mean, in the case of the vervet monkeys, it is true that those noises can be used in other sort of contexts, but they're not things where one has any sense that they're conveying any sort of abstract meaning. And this is not a criticism of the animal. They don't need to. It's absolutely unnecessary. Their environment is such that they need to warn about snakes and those sorts of things. But with regard to the teaching, and mentioning very briefly, we have the boy chimpanzees, they go and hunt colobus monkeys, okay? And there's a whole thing about meat sharing, all that sort of business. But the idea that it's an organized mafia getting the colobus monkey is absolutely incorrect. There's no plan there at all. It's not a committee deciding what to do. It's a mob. The female chimpanzees, in some but not all areas, do indeed break open nuts. And in fact, in the last issue of Current Biology, there's a very striking parallel example of a capuchin monkey doing exactly the same thing in the New World, well, here in other words. But the point here is that you need a fair amount of precision and energy to crack open a nut using, they sometimes use wood, but more often stone. And indeed, the young chimpanzee will observe this, but when it's trying to drop the stone on the thing, at no point ever will the mother try to correct its actions in the way that we explain things. And I think all of this comes together, and this is a controversial area and is by no means accepted, that effectively the animal cannot enter into another's mind. It does not have a theory of mind. And I think that's why it's so indicative, not only with teaching, but that they never say farewell. And that's, in striking difference to ourselves. And as I say, what they need is exactly what they've got. So that's in essence what I was trying to get across. But thank you. If that's, again, a fair answer to your point.
Yep. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, sure, thank you.
Hi, my name is Ellie Montiel. I'm a sophomore at Ozark Catholic Academy. So earlier you said that the origin of life is not difficult, but nearly impossible. So would you say that our Earth and our Goldilocks zone is like the best possible scenario for life?
So I didn't catch the very end of what you were asking about the origin of life on this Earth or anywhere else?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. I have a colleague, I don't know him personally, called John Sutherland in Cambridge, and by all accounts, he and others are making significant progress in assembling some of the more complex building blocks, which would ultimately provide a functioning cell. But I read quite extensively on the origin of life some years ago, and as I said to a colleague earlier today, I just gave up, because really rather little has happened. And I think the problem here will be, and some of you may know Jim Shapiro's book on the origin of life. He's got a very amusing section where you have to have this whole set of coincidences. And I can understand, although I wouldn't accept it for a moment, why some people who subscribe to intelligent design might regard this as the prima facie case. But the difficulty is, even if you were able to produce this in a laboratory by a carefully managed set of sequences, whether we could persuade ourselves that's something which would readily happen in an unexceptional environment elsewhere is at the moment completely open to question. We simply don't know. In parenthesis, I've thought for some years, and of course with the recent excitement of visits to comets and so forth, a comet would be a rather good place to do this, in as much as most of the time it's freezing cold. So the chemical reactions you need to provide these unstable organic compounds which eventually form the cell wall and the interior mechanism and so forth. You come close to the sun, everything warms up, the chemical reactions are going like crazy like that. Various recombinations are happening, then back into deep space, everything freezes together. Then sooner or later that comet impacts on the Earth. That material is then delivered to the Earth. So conceivably, many of the key steps might have been achieved on a comet. So again, it's a question of keeping your mind open rather than saying it's going to be a mystery forever. Yeah.
Thank you.
We're going backwards and forwards, are we?
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
I greatly enjoyed the talk. My question has to do with the nature of intelligence and whether or not, so I'm trained as a Thomist, so my inclination is to think that you have human intelligence and then no other kind of intelligence really, or it's just there's a sort of univocal notion of intelligence and like brute animals just don't have it. But I've taken linguistics and a number of other kinds of language empirical sciences, and there seem to be cases of animal behavior that suggest that possibly intelligence is not a univocal thing, but that there might be radically different kinds of intelligence, and that if we are assessing animal intelligence on the basis of our own tests, our own sort of benchmarks of intelligence, then we might sort of miss the nature of their intelligence. In regards to language, there's a number of interesting phenomena. I've heard of prairie dogs who, in a single squeak can communicate a whole lot of detail about a predator, whether it's a bird or a human, a brightly colored human, a large brightly colored human, and a single squeak. They can communicate that, and they do it with dialects, regional and colony-based dialects, where you put a prairie dog into a new community and they can't quite understand right away, but over time they do. Dogs are famous for their empathy. They feel deeply what you feel, and as far as the neural scans can tell us. And as a pet owner, I think we all know that dogs are very good at feeling with you. So I'm tempted to think that that animals have abilities that we don't have, and they're actually more quantifiable things. There are fish, schooling fish, that can identify the difference between two balls of fish, such that they can distinguish a ball that is bigger by one or two fish in a split second, and frogs that can make similar computations in a second, things that we can't do. So that would even seem to confirm that even by our benchmarks, there are animals that have intelligence and capacities that we don't have. But what would you say about all of that?
Thank you. I mean, you put a whole set of points together, and I'm going to find it difficult to reply to them concisely. And the points you make are extremely fair and reasonable. And it is indeed the case, or you can argue that each animal has an intelligence which is necessary for its functions. And that's sort of fair enough. And indeed, there's some papers which sort of lament the fact that if the animal shows a human-like intelligence, it's published. If it's a negative result, they're never published. So that's absolutely fair. With regard, in a sense, to how one might look at that otherwise, the fact still remains, notwithstanding what you say about the prairie dogs and so forth, is that these sorts of communications are essential for life in that environment. So if you're out there in the open and you've got big birds, condors and things like that around, you've got to be damn sure you've got, you know what to do. But there's no suggestion they go back into their burrows and sort of say, well, what a day you had, squeak, 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 squeak. Not at all. And, like the dogs themselves, I say, many animals lead these very rich social lives. And I'm not for a moment disputing that they have emotions. I'm less sure about grieving, but that's a possibility. But in that context, again, although I didn't have time to talk about it, it's pretty clear that they have no concept of death at all. What you do see is indeed female chimpanzees famously, and also certain other primates, will carry around a dead infant, sometimes a week, so it's more or less mummified, and so forth. And it's very clear in the same case as the elephants also that they understand, not in the monkeys, they sort of don't really know what's going on. The apes understand something has gone seriously wrong. They can't understand it in that sense, but they would have no conception at all that somehow they'd more or less picked themselves out and entered that other world. They're never going to pass the harbour bar. So again, it's not to dispute what the animals can do superbly, and indeed in many contexts, they have attuned capacities, which only if you know people involved with tracking do you understand, what we miss the whole time. But I still would not be persuaded that they have a theory of mind.
Yep, for one more question.
One more we have, apparently. Yep, thank you.
Last question.
Are you going to toss for it?
He just basically
Heads.
asked my
No, sorry.
question, so I'll give it over to her.
Rosencrantz, yeah. Heads. Heads. Oh.
Hi, my name is Aviva Lund. I'm a neuroscience student here at Notre Dame. My question is in terms of linguistics, or just your statement that language is important in terms of connecting with transcendence and so on. Wouldn't you think, though, that since language is mostly based upon our own earthly experiences as humans, that it actually would quite fall short of transcendence?
We do all the time, madam.
Then why is it so important if it, by definition, falls short?
Well, I'm not the one to talk about this, and even less in terms of music, but my very limited sense in poetry is that what you're actually doing is capturing something which is still language, which would be inexpressible in prose. And that's the sort of air, I get the sense I'm then on very thin ice indeed. But again, in a sense, echoing the point made just beforehand by your colleague over there, I'm not disputing that, our capacities and so forth are seriously narrow. I don't have any, particular claims in that area. But what strikes me is that, yes, I mean, deaf and dumb children and so forth will learn sign language and so forth. So it doesn't have to be uniquely vocalization. But for the great majority of people, what one finds in this thing, as I was trying to hint with Lear, or indeed a lot of other, well, not only Shakespeare, but many other people, is that they're depicting, and Macbeth is even more hideous in that sort of way, something which is truly terrible. And I'm not saying you need to subscribe to any of this, but if one's interested in the Christian theology of evil and so forth, these people are trying to put things in a context which is not explanatory, but simply descriptive. And that's all I can say.
So basically that it's just a mode of accessing transcendence, and it's a very good one at that.
Oh, indeed so, yes.
Okay.
And I mean, not everybody here likes Wagner, do they? No, I thought not. No, but I do. And there's music there, which is it's dangerous music, but it's utterly astonishing. It's transcendent.